The cleaning lady's twin daughters ran straight toward the Mafia boss. "You're our daddy." And everyone in that room stopped breathing. "You're our daddy." Two tiny voices shattered the silence of the most dangerous room in Chicago. For a split second, nobody understood what had just happened. The men sitting around that long table weren't bankers or lawyers. They were killers, enforcers, men who'd buried secrets deeper than any courtroom could dig. The screens on the wall still showed territory maps and money routes, but nobody was looking at them anymore, because two little girls had just burst through the door and wrapped their arms around the most feared man in the city. His name was Nico Ferraro. In the underworld, they called him the Silence, because he never raised his voice. He didn't need to. When Nico Ferraro whispered, people disappeared. He'd built an empire that stretched from the South Side to the Gold Coast. Casinos, real estate, restaurants that laundered more money in a week than most people saw in a lifetime. The newspapers couldn't touch him. The FBI couldn't catch him. And his own people knew one thing for certain. A single look from Nico Ferraro could freeze an entire room. But right now, Nico Ferraro didn't know what to do. One of the girls was hugging his leg with everything she had. Her dress was worn out, her shoes were too small, and her dark hair was pulled back in two messy braids. She looked completely out of place in a room full of men who carried guns under their jackets. The other twin stood in the middle of the room, staring up at 12 of the most dangerous faces in Chicago without a single trace of fear. "You're our daddy," she said again. A murmur swept across the table. One of the men reached inside his jacket out of habit. Another leaned forward like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Because everyone in that room knew something about Nico Ferraro. He'd never had children, not even during his marriage to Diana, the woman he'd loved more than anything in this world. A marriage that ended 5 years ago, when she was gunned down in a hit that was meant for him, a bullet that changed everything. Since that night, Nico had buried himself in the empire. He didn't go to gatherings. He didn't attend family dinners. He didn't let anyone get close enough to matter. The penthouse where he lived on the 57th floor of Ferraro Tower was famous for its silence. His men said the hallways felt like a mausoleum, a place where warmth had been permanently locked out, until now, because that little girl was still holding on. "Daddy," she whispered. Nico finally reacted. He looked down slowly, and for the first time in 5 years, his eyes showed something different. Confusion. "Little girl," he said, his voice low and rough, "I think you've got the wrong person." But the twin at his leg shook her head. She wasn't scared. She wasn't nervous. She was just sure. "I'm not wrong." The men started looking toward the door, and that's when the palest woman in the entire building appeared, the new night shift cleaning lady. Her name was Valerie Dunn. She'd started working at Ferraro Tower barely 2 weeks ago, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans while the city slept. When she saw her daughter standing in the middle of that room, her heart nearly stopped. "Haley! Zoe!" Her voice cracked. The girl in the middle of the room turned around. "Mommy, look. We found our daddy." The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Valerie rushed toward her daughters and gently grabbed their arms. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ferraro," she said, her voice breaking. "They don't know what they're saying." She tried to pull them away, but Haley wouldn't let go of the Mafia boss's leg. "But Mommy, he looks just like the daddy I drew." The sentence was so innocent that nobody in that room knew how to react. One of the men coughed uncomfortably. Another muttered something about security. But Nico raised one hand. That single gesture was enough to freeze every movement in the room. His eyes were still locked on the child. "Why do you say I'm your daddy?" Haley looked up at him with the kind of honesty only a child can carry. "Because when I saw you, I felt like I already knew you." The room went completely silent because those words weren't an accusation. They weren't a lie. They were simply the truth, living inside a little girl's heart. Valerie was on the edge of tears. "Sir, please forgive them. They've never had a father. They've never even met him. Sometimes they imagine things." But before she could finish, Zoe, the twin who wasn't afraid of anything, stepped forward and said something nobody expected. "We're not imagining." She looked directly at Nico Ferraro, the man the entire city feared. "Daddies aren't always the ones who are born with you." She paused for just a second. "Sometimes they're the ones who show up when you need them the most." And in that instant, for the first time in 5 years, something moved inside the frozen heart of Nico Ferraro. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Curiosity. If this story already touched your heart, go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's go back to that 57th floor, because what happened next changed everything. In the few seconds after Zoe spoke, no one in the conference room moved. 12 men sat there like stone statues, their eyes fixed straight ahead, but their minds were spinning because no one knew how this was supposed to be handled. This wasn't the kind of trouble they were used to solving. There were no guns, no enemy, no territory being invaded. Only 2 5-year-old children and a mother trembling from head to toe. Nico Ferraro remained still. His eyes didn't leave the little girl clinging to his leg. Then he lifted his gaze to the men around the table and said only one thing: "Get out." No one asked him to repeat it. No one objected. 12 chairs scraped back almost at once, and in less than a minute, only 4 people remained in the conference room: Nico, Valerie, and the 2 little girls. Valerie was still gripping her daughter's hands tightly, trying to pull them toward the door. "Mr. Ferraro, I am truly sorry. We'll leave right now." But Nico raised his hand. Not the commanding gesture from before. This time it was lighter, almost like a request. "Sit down." Valerie didn't know whether she should obey or run. Survival instinct told her never to sit down in the room of a man like Nico Ferraro, but her legs no longer had the strength to run. She sat on the edge of the chair, her back straight, both hands still holding on tightly to her children. Nico pulled out a chair and sat across from her. He didn't look at Valerie. He looked at Haley. The little girl was still standing beside him, one hand clutching the hem of his suit jacket, the other digging around in the pocket of her tiny coat. Then she pulled out a sheet of paper, wrinkled from being folded and unfolded too many times. She opened it and placed it on the walnut conference table worth tens of thousands of dollars. It was a crayon drawing, the clumsy lines of a child, the colors spilling past the edges, but the image itself was clear beyond mistake. A tall man dressed in black, standing beside 2 small children. The man in the drawing didn't have a real face, only a slight curve where the mouth should be. A smile. Nico looked at the drawing. His fingers brushed the edge of the paper. "Who is this?" Haley answered without thinking. "Daddy," Zoe cut in, her voice full of pride. "Haley drew Daddy a long time ago. She keeps drawing him over and over. Then when she saw you, she said you looked exactly like the daddy in her picture." Nico said nothing. He looked at the drawing for a few more seconds, then slowly raised his eyes to Valerie. For the first time, he truly looked at her. Not the way he looked at an employee, not the way he measured a threat. He looked at her as if he were trying to understand a story he hadn't yet been told. "Where is their father?" Valerie swallowed. "He left when I was 7 months pregnant. They've never met him. Not even once." Silence. Nico nodded slowly. Not because he understood, but because he was placing each piece of information where it belonged, the way he analyzed a business deal. "You work nights here?" "Yes. And during the day, I wait tables at a small diner in Pilsen. My shift is from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Then I go home, pick up the girls, feed them, get them to sleep, and come here for my 10 at night to 5 in the morning shift." Nico did the math in his head. "When do you sleep?" Valerie didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was there in the dark circles beneath her eyes, in her rough, dry hands, in the way she sat as if she could collapse at any moment, but was still forcing herself upright because her daughters were watching. Nico asked again, his voice still low, but with something different in it now. "Who watches them tonight?" "The neighbor. She usually helps me, but tonight she got sick and canceled at the last minute. I couldn't find anyone else. I know bringing them in here was wrong, I know. But if I miss one more shift, I won't have enough to pay rent this month." She stopped, her voice dropping lower. "And if I get thrown out, Child Protective Services will find out. And if they find out..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Nico understood. If CPS got involved, a single mother with no home, no family, 2 minimum wage jobs, and a past in the foster care system would lose custody. The girls would be sent into the very system she herself had come out of. "Where do they sleep when you work the night shift here?" Valerie lowered her eyes. "On the couch in the basement staff lounge." The answer hung in the air. 2 5-year-old girls, a basement, a couch, in the middle of the night, inside the tower of a Mafia boss. Nico said nothing for a long time. Anyone who had worked for him long enough would recognize that kind of silence. It wasn't silence from anger. It wasn't silence from indifference. It was the kind of silence that came just before Nico Ferraro made a decision no one could change. Outside the conference room door, Frank Basil stood with his arms crossed. The 62-year-old man had served the Ferraro family for 30 years. He had watched Nico grow from a 10-year-old boy into the most powerful man in Chicago. He knew every kind of Nico's silence. And the kind of silence happening behind that door right now, Frank had only heard once before in his life. The last time was the night Nico met Diana for the first time. The next morning, when Valerie led her daughters down to the basement staff lounge to collect their things before the end of her shift, she stopped in the doorway. Something was different. The old sofa was still there, but beside it, pushed neatly into the corner, were two small folding beds, fresh white sheets, two new blankets, soft, still holding the fold lines from the store, and on the little table beside the beds sat a box of 64 crayons, the biggest kind any child could dream of owning. There was no note, no name, not a single explanation. Zoe ran into the room at once. "Mommy, beds, real beds." She threw herself onto one of them, rolling back and forth, laughing with the bright, breathless joy of someone touching luxury for the first time. And maybe that was exactly what it was. Haley moved more slowly. She didn't look at the beds. She looked at the crayon box. Her fingers touched the lid, opened it, and her eyes lit up in a way Valerie almost never got to see. 64 colors. Not the cheap 12-color box Valerie bought at the dollar store. 64 colors, with names Haley probably couldn't even read yet. Valerie stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame. She knew who had done this. No one needed to tell her. In this building, there was only one man who could order things brought into the staff room at midnight without anyone daring to ask why. She wanted to say thank you, but she also knew that man wasn't the kind who wanted to hear those two words. On the 57th floor, Nico Ferraro sat behind his desk, reviewing the financial reports from the night before, as if nothing had happened. Frank Basile walked in without knocking. He was the only man alive who dared do that. Frank had served the Ferraro family since before Nico knew how to hold a gun. He had started as Nico's father's driver, then slowly became the man who managed everything in the house, from schedules to meals, from personal security to the suits pressed smooth each morning. 30 years. He had watched Nico grow from a 10-year-old boy who had lost his mother into the man the entire city bowed its head to. He had stood beside Nico at his father's funeral. He had stood beside Nico at Diana's funeral. And in the 5 years afterward, he was the only one who had stayed close when everyone else kept their distance. Not because Frank wasn't afraid of Nico, but because Frank knew what no one else did, that behind the cold man was still a 10-year-old boy sitting beside his mother's bed, waiting for a breath that would never come again. Frank set a cup of black coffee on the desk. No sugar, no cream. In 30 years, he had never prepared it wrong. Then he straightened and looked at Nico, speaking in the same calm tone a man might use to talk about the weather. 2 folding beds, new blankets, and a box of 64 crayons. Nico didn't look up. "Is that so? You haven't cared about any small thing in 5 years, sir." "Not one. I put flowers on your desk on Diana's birthday 3 years ago, and you told me to take them away. I suggested changing the living room so it wouldn't feel so empty, and you said there was no need. Mrs. Henderson on the 32nd floor had a baby. The whole building sent a gift, and you wouldn't sign the card." Frank paused. "But last night, at 2 in the morning, you called and told me to find 2 children's beds and the biggest box of crayons they make." Nico turned the page of the report. "Children shouldn't sleep on a sofa. Their backs will hurt." Frank looked at him for a few more seconds. The old man knew better than to push. 30 years had taught him one thing. Nico Ferraro would never admit he cared about anyone. He would buy beds for children and say it was because their backs would hurt. He would buy a box of 64 crayons and say it was because the smaller box didn't have enough colors. He would keep the cleaning woman on and say it was because no replacement had been found yet. But Frank knew the truth. The last time Nico Ferraro had cared enough about someone to act at 2 in the morning, her name had been Diana, and she had been in the ground for 5 years. The old man didn't say another word. He picked up the silver tray, turned, and walked toward the door. But just before stepping across the threshold, he stopped. He didn't turn around. He only spoke softly enough for Nico to hear. "That box of crayons has a color called midnight blue. That was Mrs. Diana's favorite color." Then he walked away. Nico didn't answer, but the hand holding the page of the report went still, and in the vast room on the 57th floor, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't as heavy as before. It was lighter, thinner. As if someone had just opened the smallest crack in the wall Nico had built around himself for 5 years, and one fragile line of light had finally slipped through. 3 days after that night, Nico called Frank into his office. He didn't look up from the stack of papers on his desk when he spoke. "Tell Miss Dunn to bring the children up here tonight." Frank stood still for a beat. "To the penthouse, sir. The children shouldn't be sleeping in the basement. There are empty rooms up here." Frank didn't ask anything else. 30 years had taught him when to stay quiet, but when he turned to leave, the corner of the old man's mouth lifted slightly, so quickly that if anyone had seen it, they would have thought they imagined it. That evening, Valerie stood outside the penthouse door on the 57th floor, one hand holding Haley's hand, the other holding Zoe's. She had changed the girls into the cleanest clothes they had, but the cleanest still meant a t-shirt without stains and jeans without torn knees. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. Nico Ferraro's penthouse was as large as the entire first floor of the apartment building where Valerie lived on the south side. Dark gray marble floors, ceilings higher than any room she had ever stepped into, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the whole Chicago skyline, millions of lights flickering below like a glowing carpet, stretching all the way to Lake Michigan. The furniture was dark, expensive, every piece set in exactly the right place with distances measured down to the centimeter. But there wasn't a single photograph, not one family picture, not one keepsake, not one sign that anyone truly lived here. The penthouse looked more like a showpiece in an architecture magazine than a home. Zoe was the first to react. She let go of her mother's hand, ran straight into the middle of the living room, spun in a circle, her eyes so wide they looked as if they might fall out. "Oh my God, this house is bigger than our whole block." She ran to the window and pressed her tiny hands against the cold glass. "Mommy, look. I can see the whole city." Then she turned to Nico, who was standing beside the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. "Uncle Nico, do you live here all alone? All alone in a house this big?" Nico nodded. Zoe frowned as if she had just heard the worst news of her life. "That's so sad." Valerie almost choked. "Zoe, don't." But Nico gave a slight shake of his head, letting her know it was fine. While Zoe raced from room to room like a small storm, Haley walked slowly down the long hallway. She didn't shout. She didn't get excited. She observed. Every wall, every corner, every empty space. Then she stopped. In the middle of the main hallway, on the largest wall in the penthouse, there was an empty rectangular space. The paint around it was slightly darker than the rest, leaving behind a faint outline, like the ghost of something that had hung there for a very long time before being taken down. The mark was large enough for a big photograph. Haley reached up and touched the wall. Her tiny fingers moved across the faded outline. "Who used to be here?" Her voice was soft, not asking anyone in particular, but almost as if she were asking the wall itself. Valerie saw it and felt her heart tighten. She stepped forward quickly. "Haley, don't touch other people's things." But Nico was already standing right behind her. He looked at the empty wall. 5 years earlier, that was where his wedding photograph with Diana had hung. The picture had been taken in Napa Valley, Diana in a white dress, smiling brightly, her hair lifting in the evening wind. On the night Diana was shot, Nico came home at 3 a.m, his wife's blood still on his sleeve, and the first thing he did was take that photograph down. He couldn't bear to look at that smile every day, knowing he would never see it in real life again. The wall had stayed empty ever since. 5 years. No one dared ask why. No one dared hang anything there. Until now. Haley turned and ran back to the living room where she had left her little backpack. She searched inside, pulled out the crayon drawing, the same one she had shown Nico in the conference room that night. The man in black standing beside 2 little girls. She ran back into the hallway, rose onto her toes, and taped the picture in the middle of the empty space on the wall. The tiny, wrinkled paper, the crayon colors bleeding across the page, sat in the center of the huge, empty space where a wedding photograph worth thousands of dollars had once hung. It looked out of place. It looked a little ridiculous. But it also looked like the most right thing that had been placed on that wall in 5 years. "So the wall won't be lonely anymore," Haley said, her voice light as breath. Valerie stopped breathing. She looked at Nico, ready to apologize, ready to take the drawing down, ready to grab her girls and run for the door if she had to. But Nico wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the drawing. The crayon picture by a 5-year-old child on the wall that had once held the wedding photo of his dead wife. And something in his chest, something that had lain still for 5 years, began to move. Not love, not pain, but protectiveness. The instinct he had thought died with Diana. The instinct that made a man want to stand between a child and the rest of the world. Nico didn't say anything. He only lowered himself slowly to the floor, right beside Haley. It was the first time in 5 years that anyone had seen Nico Ferraro sitting on the floor. He, the man at the top of an empire, the man who made everyone stand when he entered a room, was now sitting on the marble floor beside a 5-year-old girl in an old t-shirt. Haley looked at him. "Do you like the picture?" Nico looked at the wall. "Yeah, just one word." But that word carried more weight than any speech he had ever given in front of enemies, business partners, or the family council. Zoe ran over and dropped down beside them. "I want to draw more. The wall is still so empty." And right then, a small laugh escaped Nico's mouth. Not a loud laugh, just a breath, leaving him a little faster than usual, with the corner of his mouth lifting. But it was the first laugh that had sounded in this penthouse since Diana died. Frank stood out in the hallway, a silver tray in his hand, looking through the narrow opening in the door. He saw Nico sitting on the floor. He saw the 2 little girls beside him. He saw the crayon drawing on the empty wall. The old man set the tray down, turned his face away, and quietly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. 30 years. He had waited 30 years to hear laughter in this house again. From that night on, everything changed without anyone saying it out loud. Valerie still worked the night shift, but the girls no longer slept in the basement. Nico arranged for Haley and Zoe to stay in the penthouse every night while their mother worked. Frank was the one who watched them. There was no contract, no formal arrangement, just a nod from Nico and one short sentence to Valerie. "Leave the girls up here. Frank will be here." Valerie wanted to refuse. Everything in her was screaming that this wasn't her place, that she shouldn't owe anyone anything, especially not a man the entire city feared. But then she looked at Haley, drawing on the penthouse floor, and Zoe telling Frank about the stray cat the girls fed on the back steps of their building, and she understood that this was the first time in her daughter's lives they had slept somewhere warm, safe, and wide enough that they didn't have to curl into each other on a dirty couch beneath the fluorescent light of a basement. She nodded, and said nothing more. But in that 57-story tower, it wasn't only Valerie, Nico, and the girls. There were other eyes watching, and not all of them were watching with warmth. Those eyes belonged to Gianna Ferraro. She stood on the 42nd floor, inside the private office Nico had given her 5 years earlier, when he handed the entire financial arm of the empire over to her control. Gianna was 33, Nico's cousin, the daughter of his uncle, who had died when she was 15. She had grown up in the shadow of the Ferraro family, raised to understand that in this world, money was blood and power was oxygen. Without either one, you died. Gianna wasn't beautiful in a soft way. She was beautiful the way a properly sharpened blade was beautiful. Sharp, cold, and always ready to cut. She wore designer clothes not because she liked them, but because she understood that appearance was the first weapon people saw. She ran the finances of the entire empire, without ever letting her hand tremble when signing orders to move millions of dollars from one account to another, through companies no one knew belonged to whom. And in the 5 years Nico had locked himself away on the 57th floor, Gianna had been the one keeping the machinery below from collapsing. She knew that. And she also knew that it had its price. The news reached her through a phone call from the night guard she had planted in the building long ago. The new cleaning woman and her 2 kids are staying in the penthouse. Mr. Ferraro arranged it. Gianna didn't react right away. She set the phone down, opened her laptop, and spent 15 minutes going back through Valerie Dunn's personnel file. Then she called Tommy. Tommy Ferraro, 30 years old, Gianna's younger brother, was Nico's official consigliere, the man standing between the boss and the rest of the empire, carrying words, passing down orders, arranging everything. On the surface, Tommy was the easiest member of the family to be around. He smiled often, knew how to talk, knew how to pour a drink at the right moment and keep quiet at the right one. But the people who truly understood Chicago's underworld all knew one thing. Gianna was dangerous because she couldn't hide her ambition, but Tommy was more dangerous because he could. Tommy answered on the second ring. "Our dear cousin is getting soft," Gianna said, with no need for a warm-up. Silence on the other end. Then Tommy asked, "Soft how?" "The kind of soft that lets the cleaning woman's daughters sleep in his penthouse." The kind that buys children's beds at 2 in the morning. The kind that sits on the floor with little kids. Tommy let out a breath. Maybe he's just being kind. Gianna would have laughed if she were the kind of woman who laughed. Nico Ferraro isn't kind. He never does anything without a reason. And if the reason here is emotion, then we've got a problem. What problem? Gianna pushed her chair back, stood up, and walked to the glass wall overlooking the city. Think about it. Nico has no children, no wife, no direct heir. Under the family agreement, if he dies or steps down without a successor, total control passes to our branch of the family, which means us, Silence. But if he suddenly has an heir, if he adopts someone, if he puts anyone in that position, then the agreement means nothing anymore. Everything we've waited 5 years for disappears. Tommy stayed quiet longer than usual. You're talking about 2 5-year-old children. I'm talking about the future. Gianna turned away from the glass. Diana was also just a woman. An ordinary woman who walked into Nico's life, and before anyone realized what was happening, she had her hands on half the empire. Nico was ready to share everything with her. Power, wealth, even secrets that not even we were allowed to know. If she hadn't died, we'd probably have been pushed to the margins a long time ago. Diana was his wife. These are just little kids. Gianna lowered her voice. Today they're little kids, Tommy. Tomorrow it's adopted children. Next week it's an heir. And when that happens, you and I won't be the most important people in this family anymore. We'll be the leftovers, the ones shoved aside, the ones Nico doesn't need anymore. Silence. A kind of silence completely different from the silence on the 57th floor. This silence was cold, calculated, and carried the smell of danger. Tommy finally spoke. So what do you want to do? Gianna sat back down, reopened Valerie Dunn's file on the laptop screen. Her eyes moved quickly over the lines. Foster care since childhood. No college degree. 2 minimum wage jobs. Single mother. No family. No one behind her. And she smiled. Not the smile of someone amused. The smile of someone who had just found an opponent's weak spot. First, we dig deep into this cleaning woman. Everything. Every dark corner. Every mistake. She closed the laptop. And when we've got enough, we'll make sure she and those kids disappear from this building before Nico realizes he's made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside the glass on the 42nd floor, Chicago still blazed with light. But inside that room, the darkness had already begun to move. Gianna didn't wait long. The very next afternoon, she stepped into the private elevator reserved for the family and swiped her card for the 57th floor. She knew Nico wasn't in the penthouse at this hour because he was meeting with partners in the Gold Coast, a money laundering deal through a seafood restaurant chain that Tommy had arranged the month before. Gianna chose her moment precisely when Nico was away. She didn't need to confront her cousin. She needed to assess the enemy. The elevator doors opened. The sound of Gianna's heels striking the marble floor echoed in a steady rhythm, like the ticking of a countdown clock. She walked down the hallway, through the living room, and stopped at the open kitchen area. Valerie was wiping down the stone countertop, her back slightly bent from exhaustion after the night shift. Haley and Zoe sat on the floor beside the kitchen island, crayons scattered everywhere, both little heads bowed in concentration over their drawings. Gianna took in the entire scene, and she saw exactly what she feared most: comfort. 2 children sitting on the floor of the penthouse of the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, as if it were their home, crayons strewn across marble that cost more than a month's wages for their mother. And the cleaning woman wiping the kitchen counter as if being on the 57th floor were the most ordinary thing in the world. Interesting, Gianna said. Valerie flinched and turned around. She had never met this woman before, but the survival instinct she had sharpened through years in foster care, through Tyler's beatings, through nights spent sleeping on the street, that instinct came alive at once. The woman standing in front of her was dangerous. Not the kind of dangerous that used fists, the kind of dangerous that used words like a surgeon's blade. Precise, clean, and leaving behind a cut that wouldn't start hurting until days later. "I'm sorry, you are," Valerie began. Gianna didn't let her finish. She stepped into the kitchen, her eyes moving over Valerie from head to toe, from her hastily tied hair to her worn-out sneakers, and she made no effort to hide that judgment. Gianna Ferraro, Nico's cousin. She paused, tilting her head slightly, and the woman who manages the finances for everything he owns. That introduction wasn't a greeting. It was a declaration of territory. Valerie understood immediately. She set the cloth down and took a step back toward the children. My cousin is famous for having no weakness, Gianna said, her voice light as if she were talking about the weather. 20 years in this business, and no one has found a way to shake him. The FBI tried. Other families tried. Even Diana needed 2 years before she could make him smile. She looked around the penthouse, glanced at the crayon drawing on the empty wall in the hallway, then turned back to Valerie. Turns out I was wrong. He does have a weakness. Gianna's eyes dropped to the 2 girls on the floor. And that weakness is drawing pictures on his floor. Valerie felt the blood go cold along her spine. She pulled Haley and Zoe a little closer. I'm only doing my job, Miss Ferraro. Mr. Nico was kind enough to let the girls stay here because he got soft, Gianna cut in, her voice still sweet, though her eyes were not. And getting soft in this world is the fastest way to lose everything. Zoe looked up from the drawing she was working on. She stared at Gianna with round eyes. Not afraid, only curious. Who are you? I'm Uncle Nico's real family, sweetheart. Gianna smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. I was here before you came, and I'll still be here after you leave. Zoe tilted her head, thought for a moment, then said with the blunt honesty only a child could have, Then how come I've never seen you come play with Uncle Nico? Silence, the kind of silence as sharp as a razor. Gianna didn't answer. The smile on her lips vanished. Not slowly. It went out all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. A 5-year-old child had just asked the question no one in the Ferraro family had dared ask in 5 years. Nico sat alone on the 57th floor, and no one visited, no one called, no one cared. And Gianna, the woman calling herself real family, hadn't gone up to that floor once unless there was business to discuss. Valerie saw Gianna's face change, and her stomach tightened, because she realized that she and her daughter had just accidentally touched the deepest wound this woman carried. Not the pain of loss, the pain of truth laid bare. Gianna drew in one short, controlled breath. She adjusted her collar, turned, and walked toward the elevator. Her heels struck the marble again, this time faster than when she had arrived. But just before the elevator doors closed, she turned back for one last look. Not at Valerie, at the children. And that look was no longer one of irritation. It was the look of someone who had just identified the enemy. The look of someone who had just decided that these 2 5-year-old girls, with their crayons and crooked little drawings, were the greatest threat she had ever faced in her life. The elevator doors closed. Gianna disappeared, but the scent of her expensive perfume lingered in the penthouse air, heavy, cold, and unpleasant. Like a warning everyone could smell, but no one yet knew how to read. That night, Gianna didn't sleep. She sat in the private office of her apartment on the 42nd floor, a pale yellow desk lamp casting light across her sharp, cold face, and spread Valerie Dunn's personnel file across the oak desk. She read every page. Slowly, carefully. The way she read the financial reports of companies the family was preparing to swallow whole. Valerie Ann Dunn, born in Joliet, Illinois. Her father walked out when she was 10, vanished without leaving an address. Not one phone call, not $1 of support. Her mother was a severe alcoholic and died when Valerie was 19 of liver failure. From the age of 10 to 18, Valerie lived in the Illinois foster care system, passed through 4 different families, and none of them kept her longer than 2 years. No college degree. Dropped out of community college halfway through because she didn't have the money. She had worked as a waitress, a supermarket cashier, a hotel housekeeper, a restaurant dishwasher. And there was one more detail that Gianna underlined twice in red ink. She had once filed for a restraining order against Tyler Marsh, her ex-boyfriend, for domestic violence. The order was approved, but Tyler disappeared before the police could serve it. Gianna leaned back in her chair, laced her fingers in front of her chest, and smiled. Not the smile of satisfaction. The smile of a chess player who had just seen the whole board and realized her opponent had no pieces worth fearing. The doorbell rang. Tommy stepped in, a glass of whiskey in his hand, moving with the easy calm of a man out for an evening stroll instead of arriving for a midnight conspiracy. Finished reading, Gianna pushed the file toward her brother. No family, no degree, no relatives, no lawyer, not a single person standing behind her. She paused. This is the easiest kind of person to deal with, Tommy. She has nothing to lose except those 2 children, and that's exactly the fatal weakness. Tommy flipped through a few pages of the file. What are you planning to do? Gianna stood up and walked to the window. The city lights reflected in her eyes. The simplest plan is always the best one. She violated security. She brought 2 unauthorized children into the building, during the night shift, into a restricted area. That's a valid reason for termination that no one can challenge, not even Nico. Nico allowed the children to stay. Nico gave permission with his mouth. There's no paper trail, no email, nothing in black and white. And in the building's administrative system, personnel decisions go through Connie Rivas, not through Nico. Tommy took a sip of whiskey. Connie won't dare. Connie will do it if she understands that not doing it will cost her her job. Gianna's voice was as calm as if she were discussing a change of coffee supplier for the building. I signed the paychecks for the entire administrative staff. Connie knows that. Tommy set his glass down and leaned forward. And if Nico finds out, he'll be angry. But once she's already out of the building, he won't pull her back in. Nico isn't the kind of man who chases after anyone. He never has been. She turned to look at Tommy. He'll be angry for a week. Then he'll forget, and everything will go back to normal. Tommy nodded slowly. Then he pulled out his phone, scrolled through a few messages, and spoke in a lighter voice, but one that was colder underneath. Do you remember Tyler Marsh? Gianna frowned. The ex-boyfriend, the children's biological father. He's in Chicago, South Side. He owes a gang $80,000 from gambling. He's hiding like a rat. He'd do anything for money. Gianna looked at her brother. Where did you dig that up? Tommy smiled. The smile everyone liked, but no one should ever trust. I always have a backup plan. Gianna thought for a moment. Keep him in reserve. Don't use him yet. Plan A first. If Connie can fire her cleanly, there's no need to pull outsiders into this. The fewer traces, the better. And if Plan A fails... Gianna walked back to the desk, folded Valerie's file closed, and smoothed the crease flat. Then we use Tyler Marsh. The biological father shows up demanding custody. Legal. Clean. No one suspects a thing. She placed the file in the drawer and locked it. One way or another, the cleaning woman and those little girls will be out of this building within a week. Tommy stood up, picked up his whiskey, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back to look at his sister. Sometimes I think you're colder than Nico. Gianna didn't look up. Nico is cold because he has nothing left to lose. I'm cold because I don't allow myself to lose anything. The office door closed. Gianna turned off the desk lamp. The room sank into darkness. But on the 57th floor, 15 levels above her, the darkness was completely different. Valerie was sitting on the penthouse floor, her back resting against the base of the sofa, her 2 daughters sleeping soundly on either side of her. Haley was curled up on the left, still clutching the midnight blue crayon in her hand, the half-finished new drawing lying on her chest. Zoe lay on her back to the right, her mouth slightly open, her hair spread across the pillow, one leg draped over her mother's stomach. Valerie looked out through the glass. The whole of Chicago stretched before her. Millions of lights, millions of lives, millions of stories. And for the first time in many years, she felt that she wasn't fighting, she wasn't running, she wasn't forcing herself to survive through one more day. For the first time, she felt safe. Her daughters were sleeping on a warm floor, in a clean room, beneath a roof where no one was throwing them out. And there was a man, though she didn't understand why, who had decided they deserved to be there. She pulled the blanket higher over Haley's shoulder, then over Zoe's stomach. She rested her head against the sofa, her eyelids growing heavy, and for the first time in many years, she fell asleep without crying. She didn't know that 15 floors below her, her file had already been folded shut and locked inside a drawer. She didn't know that her name had already been placed on the scale. She didn't know that the feeling of safety she had just touched for the first time in her life had already been handed its death sentence by a woman sitting 15 floors below her, in the dark, with a smile as cold as steel. 2 days later, Gianna made her move. Connie Rivas got the call at 8 in the morning, before she had even finished pouring her first cup of coffee. Gianna's voice on the other end was brief, clipped, and precise as a military order. Valerie Dunn, security violation, brought unauthorized persons into a restricted area. Handle it before noon. Connie wanted to object. She knew Valerie. She was the one who had interviewed her, the one who had seen the dark circles under the young woman's eyes, and decided to give her a chance, because she knew what it meant to be a mother doing everything she could so her children would have food to eat. But Connie also knew exactly who Gianna Ferraro was. She knew Gianna signed the paychecks for the entire administrative department. She knew that in this building, Gianna controlled the flow of money. And the person who controlled the flow of money also controlled the professional life of everyone else. Connie didn't object. At 10 in the morning, Valerie was called into the Human Resources office on the 3rd floor. She stepped inside and saw Connie Rivas sitting behind the desk, her hands clasped together, her eyes lowered. Valerie knew at once. She had seen that look many times in her life. The look of someone about to hand her bad news but not brave enough to meet her eyes. "Sit down, Val." Valerie sat. Her back was straight. Her hands rested on her thighs. She didn't shake. She was used to rooms like this. Rooms where people called her in, avoided looking at her, and then told her she couldn't stay anymore. Foster care had taught her that when she was 10. "Val, I'm so sorry." Connie swallowed. "There's been a report of a security violation, bringing unauthorized persons into a restricted area of the building outside working hours." "The girls," Valerie said, and it wasn't a question. The decision came from above, not from Mr. Ferraro. Connie stressed that part as if she wanted Valerie to understand that she didn't want to do this, that this wasn't her choice, that she was sorry. But sorry didn't change anything. Valerie sat still for a moment. She didn't ask who had made the decision. She didn't need to. The scent of that expensive perfume from the woman the day before was still trapped in her memory. "Today is your last day. Your full pay will be transferred to your account." Valerie nodded. "Give me 10 minutes. She stood, said nothing else. Didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't plead. She had done all those things enough times in her life to know they never changed the outcome. She walked out of the Human Resources office, her heart heavy with lead, and took the elevator up to the 57th floor penthouse one last time to gather her daughters. The 2 girls were there in the spacious guest suite. Zoe was sitting on one of the large, soft beds Nico had provided, her legs swinging, singing something under her breath with no clear words. Haley was lying on her stomach on the other bed, drawing. Valerie stood in the doorway and looked in. She looked at the 2 little folding beds with their fresh white sheets. She looked at the 2 new blankets someone had bought at 2 in the morning. She looked at the box of 64 crayons lying open on the floor. Crayons scattered everywhere, every single one already used at least once. And she looked at the drawing Haley had taped to the wall of their temporary bedroom in the sky, the drawing of Uncle Nico smiling with the 2 girls beside him, the one she had made again after leaving the original on the penthouse wall. All of it. Every bed, every crayon, every fold in the new blanket. None of it was just an object. It was proof that someone in this world had thought about her daughters, had cared enough to act, had bought beds because he didn't want them sleeping on a couch, had bought the biggest box of crayons because he knew a child who loved to draw deserved enough colors. And now, she had to take her daughters away again. For the first time in a long while, Valerie wanted to cry, not because she was losing a job. She had lost enough jobs to know she would find another one, but because she was losing the place where her daughters had been safe, losing the place where, for the first time in their lives, the girls had slept in real beds instead of on a sofa, losing the place where Haley had been allowed to draw with 64 colors instead of 12. She took a deep breath, forced the tears back down, and stepped into the room. "We have to go now." Zoe stopped singing. She looked at her mother, then at the bed, then back at her mother. "Go where?" "Home." "But Mommy." Tears spilled from Zoe's eyes at once. She couldn't hold them back. She didn't hide them. She cried the way children cry when they don't understand why the world is unfair, loud, and completely real. "I don't want to go. I want to stay here. I want to stay with Uncle Nico." Valerie knelt and gathered her daughter into her arms. She didn't know what to say. Every comforting phrase she had ever used in her life sounded false inside her head. "It'll be okay. We'll find somewhere else. Things will get better." All the sentences she had told herself since childhood, and not one of them had ever come true. Haley didn't cry. She lay still on the bed, staring at the ceiling for a long time. Then she sat up, took a fresh sheet of paper from her sketchbook, chose a few crayons, and started drawing, quietly, carefully, as if this were the most important picture she had ever made. Valerie looked at her older daughter, and the pain in her chest was so sharp she could barely breathe, because she understood. Haley didn't cry, because Haley had learned very early that crying never changed anything. She had learned that from her mother, and that was what hurt Valerie most. Not that her daughter had been hurt, but that her daughter had grown so used to hurt that she no longer reacted to it. Zoe was still crying in her mother's arms. Haley was still drawing, And on the page beneath her small hands, each line of crayon was shaping a new picture. The last picture she would draw in this building. The picture she would carry up to the 57th floor to say goodbye to the only man in the world who had ever made her believe that fathers were real. Haley set the crayon down when the drawing was finished. She studied it for a long moment, tilting her head left, then right, as if checking whether anything was missing. Then she folded the paper carefully, slipped it into the pocket of her coat, and turned to look at her mother. "Mommy, let me go up to the 57th floor." Valerie was stuffing the small blanket into her bag. Her hand stopped. "Baby, we can't. Just one last time, Mom." Haley's voice was small but steady. Not the voice of a child asking, the voice of a child needing. She needed to say goodbye. Valerie looked at her daughter and saw the thing she feared most in those eyes. Acceptance. Haley wasn't begging to stay. She wasn't angry. She wasn't screaming. She only wanted the chance to say goodbye properly, because her whole life, she had never been allowed to say goodbye to anyone. Her father left without goodbye. Her grandmother died without goodbye. Every time they were moved in the foster care system, her mother was taken away before she could say anything. Haley didn't want this time to be the same. "All right," Valerie said, her voice rough. "One last time." The three of them stepped into the elevator. Zoe held her mother's hand, her eyes swollen red, still sniffling. Haley stood on the other side, one hand gripping the strap of her coat pocket, the other pressing the button for the 57th floor. The elevator rose. 57 floors had never felt so long. When the doors opened at the top floor, the penthouse hallway was empty. Frank wasn't here at this moment. Valerie knew Nico's private office was at the end of the hall, the heavy oak door she had wiped down again and again over the past 2 weeks. Haley walked first. She moved down the hallway, past the empty wall where the first crayon drawing was still taped there, brushing her fingers lightly over the edge of the paper as she passed like a silent greeting, then kept going to the end of the hall. She stopped in front of the wooden door, drew in a breath, then pushed it open. Nico Ferraro was sitting behind his desk, his back turned toward the door, his face toward the great sheet of glass overlooking the city. He wasn't working. There were no papers on the desk, no open laptop. He was simply sitting there, looking out over Chicago below, and in that posture he didn't look like the most powerful mafia boss in the city. He looked like a man sitting alone, because he no longer had any reason to stand up. The sound of small footsteps on the stone floor made him turn. Haley stood in the doorway. Zoe stood behind her, still holding their mother's hand. Valerie stood at the threshold, not daring to step inside. "Uncle Nico," Zoe spoke first. Her voice choked, no longer the bright, innocent voice he had heard before. "We have to go now." Nico looked at the 2 children, then at Valerie. His eyes changed. Not the confusion of that first time he saw them in the conference room. This time it was something sharper, more focused, more dangerous. "Go where?" "Mommy got fired," Zoe said, and the tears started falling again. "They said Mommy broke security rules because she brought us here." Silence. The kind of silence that seemed to make the whole room draw inward. Who made that decision? Nico's voice was low, very low. Valerie spoke from the doorway. "Human resources, sir." Miss Rivas said the order came from above. Nico didn't ask anything more. He didn't need to. In this building, above only meant 2 people with enough power to give that order. One was him, the other was Gianna, and he hadn't given it. Haley stepped into the room. She walked slowly, one step at a time, as if counting how many steps she had left in this room. She stopped in front of the desk, pulled the folded paper from her coat pocket, opened it, and placed it on the walnut desktop right in front of Nico. A crayon drawing. Nico was smiling, standing in the middle, the 2 little girls on either side of him. All 3 of them were holding hands. Above them in the sky was a big, bright yellow sun, and below, in the uneven, crooked handwriting of a 5-year-old just learning to write, was one line. "Thank you for not being scared of us." Nico looked at the drawing. His hand rested on the desk, motionless. His eyes stopped on the words, "Thank you for not being scared of us." He, the man the whole city feared, was being thanked by 2 little girls for not being afraid of them, for not pushing them away when they ran in and wrapped themselves around his leg, for not calling security, for sitting down on the floor beside them, for letting their drawing hang on the empty wall. Zoe wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, then added, her voice shaking but each word clear, "And don't go back to sitting alone, okay?" She looked around the huge room, at the empty chair, at the wall of glass filled with city lights but not a single other person. Because when you sit alone, the walls get sad again. The room fell into silence. Not the familiar silence of the 57th floor. The cold, empty, feelingless silence. This silence was heavier, fuller, as if every word Zoe had just spoken was settling to the bottom of the room and soaking into every stone beneath them. Nico looked at the drawing, looked at the words, looked at the two little girls standing in front of him with red, swollen eyes, and not a trace of blame in them. Then he stood up. He rose slowly, but with weight. Not the way a man stands to say goodbye, but the way a man stands when he has just made a decision. Outside the door, Frank Bassel was standing in the hallway. No one knew when he had arrived. Quiet as always. He looked through the narrow opening of the door and recognized at once the way Nico rose. Back straight, shoulders lowered, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed as if focusing on one single point. Frank had seen Nico stand up like that exactly once in his life. The night Diana was shot. The night Nico sat in the hospital with his wife's blood dried on his sleeve and said nothing for 4 hours. Then stood up, and 3 days later, the two men responsible for the assassination vanished from the face of the earth. No one found them. Ever. That was how Nico Ferraro stood when someone touched what belonged to him, and now he was standing exactly that way again. Frank gripped the edge of the doorframe tightly, because the old man understood that what was about to happen next wouldn't just change the 57th floor. It would change the whole building, and maybe the whole family. Nico stepped out of the office with the folded drawing tucked neatly into the pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't run. He never ran. But every footstep along the hallway carried the weight of a man walking toward something he wasn't going to let anyone take from him. Frank stood against the wall, watching him pass, saying nothing, only falling silently into step a few yards behind. The old man knew this wasn't the time to speak. Nico pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. He stepped inside and hit the basement. 57 floors down to the ground. With every floor, the numbers on the display grew smaller, but something inside Nico was growing larger. It wasn't anger. He was used to anger. This was something else. Something he had thought he'd buried with Diana beneath the cold earth at Rose Hill Cemetery. The elevator doors opened in the basement. Valerie was standing at the far end of the hallway, with her back turned, one hand carrying a bag, the other holding Zoe's hand. Haley walked beside them with her little backpack on, her eyes fixed straight ahead, never looking back. The three of them were heading toward the service exit that opened onto the alley behind the building. The door the night staff used to come and go. The door no one upstairs even knew existed. No one is leaving this building. Nico's voice wasn't loud. Not at all. But in the narrow basement hallway, it hit like a hammer against concrete. Valerie stopped. Her shoulders went rigid. She turned slowly. Nico stood beside the elevator with his hands in his pockets, his back straight, his face calm. But his eyes weren't calm. His eyes were burning. Mr. Ferraro, I've been fired. I know. The decision came from above. I know. Nico took a few steps forward. And who exactly is above? Valerie stayed silent. She didn't want to say it. She didn't want to make more trouble. She just wanted to get her girls out of here before things got worse. Mr. Ferraro, I really don't want to. Miss Dunn. Nico cut her off, but not harshly. Just clearly. You're not fired. Valerie blinked. But Miss Rivas said, Miss Rivas doesn't have the authority to fire anyone in my building without going through me. Nico pulled out his phone and dialed. 1 ring, 2 rings. Gianna answered on the other end. Nico, come to the 57th floor, now. Nico hung up. He didn't wait for a reply. Then he looked back at Valerie. You and the girls go up to the penthouse. Frank will be there. Then he looked at Haley. The little girl stood still with her backpack on, staring at him without blinking. Nico didn't say anything to her. He only gave her the slightest nod. So small it was almost invisible. But Haley understood. She let go of her mother's hand, stepped forward, and took Nico's hand for just 1 second. That tiny hand wrapped around the hand that had once signed orders to erase men from the earth. Then she let go, turned back, took her mother's hand again, and walked toward the elevator. Nico watched the 3 of them until the doors closed. Then he went up alone to the 57th floor, in the private elevator reserved for the family. 15 minutes later, Gianna stepped out of the elevator on the 57th floor. She had changed into another outfit. A black blazer, wide-leg trousers, high heels, everything perfect without a single wrinkle. She knew how to prepare for a battle. Nico was standing in the penthouse living room, with his back to the door, looking out through the vast sheet of glass. The city stretched beneath him. He didn't turn when he heard the click of her heels. Close the door. Gianna closed it. Now there were only 2 people in the room. Nico, I assume this is about, you fired my employee? It wasn't a question. Gianna drew in a breath and kept her voice steady. I was protecting the family. Nico turned around. Slowly. Which family? Gianna blinked. Which family, Gianna? He took 1 step toward her. His voice was still low, still slow. The family that hasn't asked me once in 5 years if I'm all right. The family that walked away from Diana's funeral and disappeared. The family that only shows up when it needs a check signed, when it needs a deal approved, when it needs me sitting at a table playing the Mafia boss so everyone else can keep making money. Silence. Gianna opened her mouth, but Nico wasn't finished. 5 years. He said it slowly, each word landing like stone. 5 years I've sat on this floor alone. Not because I like being alone, because no one came. It was the first time in her life Gianna had ever heard Nico speak about himself. Not about the empire, not about money, not about power, about himself. And that frightened her more than any threat ever could. Because Nico Ferraro speaking about himself meant he was in a state no one had ever seen before, a state in which no one knew what he might do. Valerie Dunn returns to work, right now. Gianna clenched her jaw. You're making a mistake. Nico looked straight into her eyes. That look. Everyone in Chicago's underworld knew that look. The look that came right before someone lost everything. The only mistake here is that you thought you had the right to make decisions in my home. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The sentence sliced through the room like a knife through paper. Clean, precise, impossible to mend. Gianna stood still for 3 seconds. Then she gave 1 short nod, turned, and walked toward the elevator. Her back was straight. Her steps were even. Her face was unreadable. The elevator doors closed. Gianna stood alone inside the descending cabin. And then, when no one was watching, both her hands began to shake. Not from fear. Gianna Ferraro wasn't afraid of anyone. From rage. Because Plan A had just failed completely. Because Nico wasn't simply protecting the cleaning woman. He was protecting her the way he had once protected Diana. And that was more dangerous than anything Gianna had predicted. She pulled out her phone and called Tommy. Plan B. 2 words. No further explanation needed. On the other end, Tommy was silent for a second. Then he said, I'll meet Tyler Marsh tonight. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor. Gianna stepped out with her back still straight, and her steps still even. But inside her head, the chessboard had changed completely. And the next piece she was about to move wouldn't come from inside the building. It would come from a cheap bar on the south side, where a man who owed $80,000 was waiting for someone to save his life. Tommy Ferraro drove his black Mercedes across the bridge into the south side that night. He didn't usually come to this part of town. His leather shoes cost more than a month's rent for anyone living here. But Tommy knew that the best deals were never signed in conference rooms. They were signed in places where the light was dim enough that no one could see each other's faces too clearly. The bar was called Rosie's, tucked at the end of an alley just off Halstead Street. The neon sign flickered, missing 1 R, so all it read was Ozzy's. Inside, the smell of cheap beer mixed with old cigarette smoke and sweat. It was the kind of place people didn't come to for a good time. They came to drink so they could forget. Tyler Marsh sat at the last table in the darkest corner. He was 29, but looked 40, thin enough that his jawbone pushed sharp beneath his skin. Hollow eyes, deep shadows under them, pupils drifting slightly from the alcohol. An old jacket worn thin at the shoulders. Fingers stained yellow from cigarettes. He was staring into a nearly empty beer with the eyes of a man who'd given up a long time ago. Tommy pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Then he placed a thick envelope on the sticky tabletop. Tyler Marsh. Tyler looked up. His eyes tightened at once, the instinct of a man hiding from debt the moment he realized someone knew his name. Who are you? Tommy Ferraro. Tyler went still. The Ferraro name in the South Side was like a warning siren. Everyone knew it. Everyone avoided it. I don't owe the Ferraros anything. That's right. You owe the Reyes gang $80,000. Tommy said it calmly, like he was reading from a menu. And as far as I know, your deadline is the end of this month. 11 days left. Tyler swallowed. His hand tightened around the beer glass. You know what happens when people don't pay Reyes on time, don't you? Tommy didn't need to wait for an answer. The whole South Side knew. A man who owed Reyes $50,000 last year had been found in Lake Michigan. Part of him, anyway. There's $80,000 in this envelope. Tommy pushed it toward Tyler. Enough to wipe it clean. Tyler looked at the envelope. His eyes lit up, then darkened again immediately, because he knew no one gave away money for free, especially not the Ferraro family. In exchange for what? Your ex-girlfriend, Valerie Dunn. Tyler blinked. He hadn't heard that name in a long time, not since the night he stuffed his clothes into a backpack and walked out of the apartment in Pilsen while Valerie was 7 months pregnant. He hadn't looked back, hadn't called, hadn't sent a single dollar. He had just disappeared, because that was the only thing Tyler Marsh had ever been good at, disappearing. She's living very comfortably in my family's tower right now, Tommy said, leaning forward and lowering his voice, along with the twin daughters she had 5 years ago. Yours. Tyler froze. 2 children, twin girls, 5 years old. He did the math in his head. 7 months when he left. 2 months later, she gave birth. 5 years ago. I have kids. 2 little girls. Tommy pulled out his phone and opened a photo secretly taken by the guard planted inside the tower. 2 little girls in simple clothes, sitting on the penthouse floor and drawing. Tyler looked at the picture. He stared at it longer than Tommy expected. Something flickered in his eyes. Something faint. Maybe regret. Maybe pain. But it vanished quickly, sinking beneath the alcohol and fear, and the weight of the $80,000 hanging over his head. What do I have to do? Tommy smiled. It was the easy smile everyone liked, and no one should ever trust. Simple. You go to Ferraro Tower. You claim your children. You pull Valerie out of the building. You're the biological father. You have legal rights. But I don't have anything to prove it. Already handled. Tommy pulled a packet of documents from his leather briefcase. Our lawyers already filed for paternity rights on your behalf. DNA testing isn't necessary at this stage. All you need is a petition and a sworn statement that you're the father. The court will review it, but in the meantime, you've got enough legal standing to demand access to the children. If Valerie refuses, she's the one in violation. Tyler looked at the documents, then at the envelope, then at Tommy. And after it's done, you've got $80,000, no more debt, and you can go wherever you want. Tyler picked up the envelope. Its weight in his hands felt heavier than any decision he'd ever made. Then he shoved it into his jacket pocket. 2 days later, Tyler Marsh showed up in the lobby of Ferraro Tower. Security didn't stop him. Tommy had arranged everything. The guard at the entrance had already been given instructions. Let him through. Don't ask questions. Don't log it. Tyler took the elevator up to the penthouse floor. He stepped into the hallway and heard children's laughter drifting from inside. He stopped for a second. That laughter felt strange to him in a way it shouldn't have felt strange at all. Then he walked in. Valerie was in the kitchen preparing lunch for the girls. Zoe was telling Frank about a squirrel she'd seen in the tree outside the window. Haley was drawing in the corner of the living room. When Valerie turned and saw who was standing in the doorway, the plate slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the stone floor. Shattered, the sound of breaking porcelain cut through everything else. Zoe stopped talking. Frank straightened at once. Haley looked up from her drawing. Val, Tyler's voice, rough, familiar enough to make Valerie feel sick. What the hell are you doing here? Valerie's voice was cold. It didn't shake. She had run out of shaking for this man a long time ago. The only thing left was disgust. I came to get my kids. 4 words. Simple, but each one cut through the air like a knife. Frank stepped forward on instinct, shielding the girls. Zoe looked at the strange man, her eyes narrowing, not afraid but uneasy. She pressed herself against Frank's leg. Valerie put a hand on the kitchen counter to steady herself. You don't have that right. I'm their biological father. I have legal rights. Tyler pulled out the documents Tommy had given him. The lawyer already filed the petition. Valerie looked at the documents, and her whole world tilted. Not because Tyler had come back, but because she understood immediately that Tyler Marsh wasn't smart enough, rich enough, or sober enough to hire a lawyer on his own. Someone was standing behind him. Someone was using Tyler as a chess piece. You left when I was 7 months pregnant, Valerie said, her voice calmer than she expected it to be. You didn't sign the birth certificates. You didn't send a single dollar. You don't know their names. You didn't even know they existed until someone told you. Tyler clenched his jaw. I'm still their father. Father. Valerie took one step forward. A father is the one who wakes up at 3 a.m. when a child has a fever. A father is the one who works 2 shifts a day to afford milk. A father is the one who holds his children when they cry and asks why they don't have a dad like the other kids. She stopped. You're not a father. You're just a man who happens to share DNA. A heavy silence settled over the room. Tyler opened his mouth to answer, but Haley stood up. She walked from the corner of the living room, past the broken pieces of porcelain on the floor, and stopped beside her mother. She looked at Tyler, looked at him for a long time, with eyes far too quiet for a child her age. Then she turned to her mother and said in a voice so soft it was almost impossible to hear, "He doesn't look like the daddy in my drawing." And that sentence, in English, in the whisper of a 5-year-old child, hurt more than any accusation Valerie had spoken a moment earlier, because Haley had spent her whole life drawing the image of a father she dreamed about. And the man standing in front of her now wasn't that man. He didn't look like him. He wasn't even close. He didn't belong to the same world at all. Frank didn't need to hear another word. The moment Tyler Marsh stepped into the penthouse, the old man quietly slipped into the hallway, lifted his phone, and called the one number that mattered. "One ring," Nico answered. "There's a man here claiming he's the children's biological father. He's in the penthouse. He has legal papers." Silence on the other end of the line. 3 seconds. "I'm coming up now." 4 minutes later, the private elevator doors opened on the 57th floor. Nico stepped out. He wasn't running. His footsteps were even, slow, each one falling with the exact precision of the wall clock ticking in the foyer. But Frank recognized that look at once. He had seen those eyes only twice in his life. The first time was the night Diana was shot. The second was when he told Gianna that Valerie Dunn had returned. And now, this was the third. Nico walked into the penthouse. Tyler was standing in the middle of the living room, still holding the file, saying something to Valerie about visitation rights, about lawyers, about the court. Valerie stood in front of the 2 children, pale-faced but unyielding. When Nico appeared, Tyler turned around. And even though he didn't know much about the Chicago underworld, even though he was nothing more than a debt-ridden gambler hiding out on the South Side, Tyler Marsh still recognized, through the oldest survival instinct buried in the bones of a man, that the person who had just entered the room was not an ordinary man. There was something that came off Nico without words, without gestures, with nothing but pure presence. It was the kind of thing weak men felt when they found themselves standing before someone 100 times stronger than they were. "Sit down," Nico said, his voice soft, not gentle. Soft in the way the click of a gun being cocked sounds soft. Tyler didn't sit. "Who are you?" Nico didn't answer the question. He pulled a chair away from the dining table and set it down in the middle of the room, directly across from Tyler, then sat. Slowly, comfortably, as if this were his living room and Tyler were a guest he had invited long before. This was his living room. "Sit down," Nico said again. This time Tyler sat. His legs trembled slightly, but he tried to hide it by pressing his knees together. Tyler Marsh, 29 years old, born in Gary, Indiana, moved to Chicago 6 years ago. Primary occupation? None. Secondary occupation? Gambling. Nico spoke calmly, as though he were reading from a restaurant menu. "You owe the Reyes gang $80,000. Your deadline is 11 days away. You're currently hiding in a rented room on Ashland Street, 3rd floor, window facing the garbage lot behind the laundromat." Tyler went pale, bone white, the kind of white that belongs to a man who has just realized he is sitting across from someone who knows everything. "Who brought you here?" Tyler didn't answer. $80,000. Nico tilted his head slightly. "Someone handed you $80,000 in an envelope and told you to come here and claim the children. Someone hired a lawyer to file for paternity rights on your behalf. Lawyer Aaron Webb, office on Michigan Avenue, 12th floor, correct?" Tyler swallowed. His throat was so dry that even swallowing hurt. "You don't need to answer. I already know." Nico leaned back against the chair. "The only question now is how you want to leave this place." Silence. "I'm giving you 2 choices." Nico raised one finger. 1. You leave Chicago. Tonight. Forever. You don't come back. You don't call. You don't look for them. You don't appear again. In return, I erase your entire debt with Reyes. Not just the 80,000. All of it. Every dollar. You walk out of this city as clean as the day you first stepped into it." He raised a second finger. 2. You stay." Nico paused. Then he leaned forward. The distance between their faces was now less than an arm's length. "And I'll make you understand why people call me the Silence." The sentence wasn't loud. It was almost a whisper. But Tyler Marsh heard every word as if someone had shouted straight into his ear. Because there was no anger in that voice. No threat in the style of a street thug. There was only truth. Calm, cold, absolute truth. The truth that if Tyler chose to stay, he would vanish from the face of the earth and no one would ever find him. It wasn't a threat. It was simply the truth. Tyler stood up. The chair scraped harshly across the stone floor. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He moved quickly toward the door, the legal file slipping from his hands and falling to the floor, and he didn't stop to pick it up. But as he passed through the hallway, Tyler stopped. Haley was standing there, her back against the wall where the first crayon drawing was still taped in place. She didn't know who Tyler was. Not really. She only knew that this was the man her mother was afraid of, and this was not the man who looked like the father in the pictures she drew. Tyler looked at Haley. 1 second. Maybe 2. In that moment, something flickered through his eyes. A tiny flash. Maybe regret. Maybe pain. Maybe the thought, "This is my child," rising in his mind for the first time and also for the last. Then Tyler walked away. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. And Tyler Marsh disappeared from Ferraro Tower. From Chicago. From the story. All within 4 minutes of the moment Nico gave him those 2 choices. Haley stood in the hallway and watched the elevator doors slide shut. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried when she was fired. She hadn't cried when she had to say goodbye. And now, when the man who was biologically her father walked away without looking back, she didn't cry either. She simply turned around, walked into the room Nico had arranged for the 2 sisters, opened her small backpack, and took out a piece of paper. The drawing of her father. The first drawing. The one she had made before she could even clearly say the word daddy. The one she had carried everywhere. Through every foster care house her mother had ever lived in. Through every crumbling apartment. Through every night she had held a pillow and fallen asleep alone. The drawing of a tall man dressed in black, standing beside 2 small children. The picture of the father she had believed would appear one day. Haley looked at the drawing. For the last time. Then she held the paper by both edges and tore it in half. Slowly, decisively. No sobbing. Only the sound of paper ripping, small and dry, slicing through the quiet room like the snap of a bone. She laid the 2 torn pieces on the floor. Then she stood, walked outside, and went straight to Nico. He was standing in the living room, his back to her, looking out through the great sheet of glass. Haley didn't say anything. She simply stood beside him, her shoulder lightly brushed against his leg, and she stayed there. Silent. Frank stood in the corner of the hallway, looking through the half-open bedroom door at the 2 torn pieces of paper on the floor. He recognized the drawing, the picture of a father, the one the little girl had carried with her for 5 years, and now it lay on the floor, torn in half, like a dream that had been thrown away. The old man closed his eyes, because another image rose in his mind, an image from 5 years earlier. Diana standing in her office, a file in her hand, her eyes lighting up as she said to Frank, "I found them, a pair of twins, at the children's home on the south side of the city." Frank opened his eyes again. He looked at Haley standing beside Nico. He looked at the 2 torn pieces of paper on the floor, and he knew that the time had finally come to tell Nico the secret he had kept buried for 5 years. Tommy called Gianna 10 minutes after Tyler disappeared from the building. Tyler's left Chicago. Nico handled it. Silence on the other end of the line. Longer than usual. Longer than Tommy was comfortable with. Then Gianna's voice came through, and for the first time in his life, Tommy heard something in his sister's voice he had never heard before. A loss of control. He knows. Knows what? He knows we were behind it. Nico knows Tyler didn't come on his own. He knows who hired the lawyer. He knows who paid the 80,000. Tommy drew in a breath. "Do you think he'll?" "I don't think. I know. And I'm not waiting for him to make the first move." Gianna hung up. 20 minutes later, the sound of high heels echoed on the 57th floor. but this time was different. The last time Gianna came when Nico was away, choosing the moment, choosing the opponent. This time she arrived when everyone was there. Nico was sitting on the sofa, Haley beside him, her shoulder resting against his arm like a habit that had formed naturally over the past few days. Zoe was lying on her stomach on the rug, drawing. Valerie was pouring water in the kitchen. Frank stood beside the counter, a dish towel in his hand, but his eyes never left the door. The penthouse door flew open without a knock. Gianna walked in. No black blazer this time. A white shirt tucked into her trousers, her hair loose, her face bare of makeup. She looked like someone who had gone through a sleepless night and hadn't cared to hide it, and that was more dangerous than any perfect outfit she had ever worn, because Gianna Ferraro, when she still kept up appearances, meant she was still in control. Gianna Ferraro, when she no longer cared to keep up appearances, meant she had nothing left to lose. Enough. 2 words. Her voice cut through the penthouse sharp as shattered glass. Everyone stopped. Zoe looked up from her drawing. Valerie set the water pitcher down. Frank tightened his grip on the towel in his hand. Nico didn't get up. He remained seated on the sofa, his eyes on Gianna with the calm that only a person who truly held power could possess. "You're turning the Ferraro family into a joke." Gianna stepped into the middle of the room. "All of Chicago is whispering. The other families are laughing. The people who work for us are asking questions. The silence, the boss himself, is raising a janitor's daughters in his penthouse." She looked around the room, at the crayon drawing on the wall, at the crayons scattered across the rug, at the 2 little beds half visible through the bedroom door, a cleaning woman and 2 street children. "Is that what you chose to replace Diana?" That sentence cut deep. Valerie saw Nico's shoulders stiffen for the briefest fraction of a second. Mentioning Diana crossed a line. Gianna knew that, and she did it on purpose. Valerie set the glass of water down and stepped out of the kitchen. "I'll go." Her voice was calm, but tired. She had said those words too many times in the past few weeks. "I'll take the girls and leave. We don't want to bring trouble to anyone." She turned to look at Nico. "You've already helped us more than enough." But before Nico could open his mouth, Zoe stood up. She let go of her crayon, straightened herself, and looked directly at Gianna with the kind of eyes no executive, no rival boss, no FBI agent had ever dared turn on her that way. "You said your family," Zoe said, her voice clear and steady. "You said you were here before us." Silence. "Then while Uncle Nico sat alone for 5 years, where were you?" Gianna looked down at the child. Her jaw tightened. "Little girl, the adults are talking." "I heard you." Zoe didn't back down. "I heard all of it. You said my mom is a bad person. You chased my mom away. You sent a strange man here to claim us." Gianna's eyes flickered. The child knew more than she had expected. "But I know one thing," Zoe went on. "My mom never left us. Not for a single day." She stared straight into Gianna's eyes. "And you left Uncle Nico alone for 5 whole years?" The living room fell into silence. Frank stood in the kitchen corner, gripping the towel until his knuckles turned white. Valerie covered her mouth with the back of her hand. Nico sat motionless on the sofa, and for the first time, Gianna had no answer. No razor-sharp rebuttal. No cold reply. A 5-year-old child had just spoken aloud the truth the entire Ferraro family knew, but no one had ever dared say. Then Haley stood up. She moved to stand beside her sister. She, the quietest child of all, the one who rarely spoke more than a sentence at a time, opened her mouth and said more than she ever had in her life. "I don't understand much about family." Haley's voice was soft, but not weak, like a small candle, but bright enough to see by in a dark room. "I grew up without a father. My mom had to work 2 jobs. We slept on a sofa. We never had our own room until we came here." She paused, looked at Nico, then looked at Gianna. "But I know one thing. Family isn't the person who shares your last name." Silence. "Family is the person who makes you not want to leave." That sentence hung in the air of the penthouse on the 57th floor. It wasn't loud like Zoe's accusation. It wasn't sharp like Gianna's cutting words. It was simply the truth. The truth from the mouth of a 5-year-old girl who had torn up the drawing of her father that afternoon, who had given up the last dream she had about her biological father, and who was now standing in this room beside the man she had chosen, not because of blood, not because of money, but because he hadn't walked away. Nico looked at Haley, and everyone in the room saw something in his eyes change. Not tears. Nico Ferraro didn't cry, but something softened. Something gave way. Something finally surrendered. Gianna stood in the middle of the room, her arms hanging at her sides. She looked at the two girls. She looked at Nico. And she understood that this war was no longer about money, no longer about inheritance, no longer about the empire. This was about something Gianna didn't have and couldn't buy. Love. The kind of love no one teaches, no one forces. The kind that simply appears on its own between a lonely crime boss and two homeless little girls. And Gianna couldn't fight that, because she had no weapon made for love. Nico rose from the sofa, slowly, without hurry. The way a man rises when he made the decision long ago, and is now only choosing the exact moment to speak it aloud. He stepped into the middle of the living room, stood between Gianna and the two children, between the past and something he still hadn't dared to name, but already knew was the future. 5 years, Nico said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In this penthouse, when Nico spoke, every other sound died. For 5 years I lived on the 57th floor. Hundreds of people worked for me. Thousands feared me. I could make one phone call and change an entire neighborhood within 24 hours. He paused, looked around the penthouse, looked at the bare walls he had lived with for 5 years the way a man lives inside a glass coffin. But no one, not a single person, reminded me how to laugh. Silence. Not until 2 little girls ran into my meeting room while I was deciding the future of 12 neighborhoods, wrapped themselves around my legs, and called me Daddy. He looked at Haley. She stood still, her eyes fixed on him without blinking. I'm not their father. I know that. They know that. Everyone knows that. He turned to Valerie. She stood by the kitchen, one hand gripping the edge of the stone counter, her eyes red but dry. But they taught me something no one in this entire empire ever could. He looked back at Gianna, directly, without looking away, that the greatest power in this world isn't money, isn't territory, isn't guns. He paused for a beat. It's having someone run to you not because they're afraid, but because they want to be near you. Gianna stood motionless. Her face showed nothing, but her eyes betrayed her. Something in them trembled, not tears. Gianna Ferraro didn't cry, but the realization that she was losing and there was no way to turn it around. Nico turned to her. You say family is blood. I say family is a choice. He took one step forward. And I've chosen. The silence grew so thick that Valerie felt as though the air in the room had hardened into something solid, heavy, hard to breathe through. I called my lawyer this morning, Nico said, his voice calm, as if he were announcing the result of a business deal. I'm filing for legal guardianship of Haley and Zoe Dunn. Legal protection. The first step. Valerie opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes widened. Frank stood in the corner of the room, his hand gripping the back of a chair, his knuckles white. That means they'll be protected by the law. Protected by my name. No one will come here claiming them. No one will hire a fake lawyer to drag them away. And no one, Nico said, looking straight into Gianna's eyes, will throw them out of my home. Gianna drew in a short breath. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. The biggest mistake of my life was spending 5 years living like a dead man. Silence. And if one day they want to call me Daddy, Nico said, looking at the two girls, his voice softening just a little, only a little, but enough for everyone in the room to hear it, I won't stop them. Zoe clutched her sister's hand, her eyes shining bright. Haley stood still, but her tiny hand tightened around her sister's, and her lips trembled slightly, the strongest reaction anyone had ever seen from this quiet child. Gianna looked at that scene and knew she had lost, but she wouldn't lose without striking back. Be careful, Nico, she said, her voice cold, slow, precise with every word. Money always draws the wrong people, and you have a great deal of money. That sentence was aimed at Valerie. Everyone understood. Gianna wanted to plant doubt, wanted Nico to wonder whether this woman was using him, wanted that seed to take root slowly in his mind until he pushed Valerie away with his own hands. But before Nico could respond, Zoe stepped forward. She stood right in front of Gianna, tipped her head back to look up at the woman who was 3 times her height, and said in a clear voice, without the slightest tremor, My mom doesn't need anybody's money. She paused. My mom works 2 jobs every day. My mom sleeps 3 hours. My mom hasn't bought herself new clothes since I can remember. Every dollar she makes goes to us. All of it. Silence. If my mom wanted money, she wouldn't be cleaning offices on the night shift. Gianna looked down at the child, and for the first time, She found no reply, not because she had run out of arguments, but because a 5-year-old girl had just defended her mother with the purest truth possible, and there wasn't a single answer in the world sharp enough to cut through the truth of a child. Nico looked at Zoe, then at Gianna, then he added one final sentence, his voice so low that Frank had to lean forward to hear it clearly. And from today on, if anyone touches them, he didn't raise his voice, didn't emphasize the words, only spoke evenly as though he were reading the weather report. I'll consider that the same as touching me. That sentence needed no explanation. In the Chicago underworld, in the world Gianna had grown up in the world the entire Ferraro family existed inside, that sentence had only one meaning. Whoever touched them touched Nico Ferraro, and whoever touched Nico Ferraro disappeared. Gianna stood still for 3 seconds. Then she turned, walked toward the elevator. This time there was no sharp click of high heels. She was wearing flats. Her footsteps were light, silent, like someone retreating from a battlefield. The elevator doors opened. Gianna stepped inside. Before they closed, she turned back for one last look. She didn't look at Nico, didn't look at Valerie. She looked at Haley and Zoe, 2 5-year-old girls, standing side by side, hand in hand, wearing old clothes. Shoes with the soles worn thin, crayon smudges on their fingers. They were the opponents who had defeated her. Not with money, not with power, not with schemes, but with crayons and a crooked drawing. The elevator doors closed. Gianna went down alone. 57 floors, and with every floor she passed, she understood a little more clearly that this war was over. She hadn't lost to Nico. She hadn't lost to Valerie. She had lost to 2 5-year-old girls, whose only fortune in the world was a box of 64 crayons, and the belief that a father is the person who doesn't walk away. That night, the penthouse sank into silence. Valerie had taken the girls into the bedroom. Zoe fell asleep the moment her head touched the pillow, exhausted after a day that had held far too much emotion for a 5-year-old child. Haley lay still, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, but she said nothing. She held her sister's hand tightly in her sleep, as if she feared that if she let go, everything would be gone by morning. Valerie pulled the blankets over both of them, then quietly stepped out, closing the door so gently that not a single sound escaped. Out in the living room, Nico sat alone. The lights were off, only the glow of the city filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass, laying a cold blue wash over everything. He sat in the chair by the window, a glass of liquor in his hand, but he didn't drink. His eyes were on Chicago, but he wasn't seeing it. He was thinking, not about Gianna, not about the Empire. He was thinking about the crayon drawing torn in half, the one he had seen on the bedroom floor that afternoon, after Frank told him what Haley had done once Tyler left. A 5-year-old child had torn apart the drawing she had carried her entire life, the drawing of her father, the drawing of a dream, torn clean in two, no tears. Then she had stood up and walked to his side. Nico took a sip of the bourbon. It burned hot, but it wasn't sharp enough to cover the bitterness rising in his chest. The sound of soft footsteps came from the hallway. Frank entered the living room, holding a bottle and a second glass. The old man didn't ask. He didn't need to. For 30 years, he had known when Nico needed to be alone, and when Nico needed someone to sit beside him, without saying a word. Tonight was the second kind. Frank poured the drink, set the glass on the glass table beside Nico's chair, then lowered himself into the chair across from him. The two men sat in the dark, silent, looking out at the city. 10 minutes passed, maybe longer. Then Frank spoke. There's something I've kept buried for 5 years. Nico didn't turn his head, but his hand tightened slightly around the glass. This afternoon, when I saw the girl tear up that drawing of her father, Frank said slowly, word by word, as if he were weighing how gently each one should be laid down, it reminded me of something Miss Diana once held in her hands. At the sound of Diana's name, Nico went rigid. His whole body locked, as if that name were a second bullet. The first one had killed her, and the second killed him every time someone spoke it. Frank. Nico's voice was a warning, low, dangerous. I know you don't want to hear this. Frank didn't back away, but you need to. The silence stretched. Nico said nothing, and Frank understood that was the only permission he was going to get. 6 months before Diana died, she came to see me in the kitchen. One morning, you had already left early. She was holding a file, thick, stamped with papers from an adoption agency on the south side of Chicago. Frank paused, took a sip of his drink, then continued. She told me the two of you had been trying to have a child for years, that the doctors said the chances were very low, and she didn't want to tell you because she was afraid it would hurt you, so she looked for another way on her own. Nico looked at Frank for the first time since the old man had begun speaking. She found a pair of twins. 2 little girls. They were at St. Catherine Orphanage on the south side of the city. She had almost finished everything. The home study was approved. The adoption papers were nearly complete. She told me she wanted everything finalized before she told you. She wanted it to be a surprise. Frank stopped. His voice grew rough. The papers weren't signed yet when she was shot. Silence. The kind of silence no word on earth could ever fill. Nico said nothing for a very long time. The glass in his hand didn't move. His eyes stared into space, at something Frank couldn't see. Maybe the past. Maybe Diana's face. Maybe that morning when she stood in the kitchen holding a file he had never known existed. Why didn't you tell me? Nico's voice was almost too faint to hear. Frank looked straight at him. Because after Diana died, you didn't want to hear anything connected to her. You took the wedding picture off the wall. You closed up her room. You forbade everyone in the house from speaking her name. I put flowers on your desk on her birthday, and you told me to take them away. Frank lowered his voice. If I had told you then, you wouldn't have listened. You would have been angry, and you would have burned that file the way you burned everything that reminded you of Diana. Silence. So I kept it, and I waited. Waited for what? Waited until you were ready. Frank looked toward the hallway, where the bedroom door of the 2 girls stood slightly ajar. And this afternoon, when I saw that little girl tear up the drawing of her father, Frank turned back to Nico. I understood that the time had come, because that child had just given up the dream of the father she had been drawing all her life, and she chose to stand beside you. The old man paused. Then he added one final sentence, gently, but heavier than anything else he had said that night. Sometimes the things we lose find their way back to us, in another form. Then Frank stood, picked up the bottle, and walked out of the room without turning back. Nico sat there alone. The lights of Chicago still flickered below. The glass was still in his hand, but he had forgotten it long ago. He looked toward the hallway, the empty wall, the wall where Diana's wedding portrait had once hung, the wall that now held a crayon drawing taped in the middle of it, Haley's first drawing. A man dressed in black standing beside 2 small children. Nico didn't believe in fate. He didn't believe in signs. He didn't believe in the stories people told each other so they could feel less alone. But tonight, sitting in the dark, looking at the crayon drawing on the wall where his wife's portrait had once been, he couldn't deny one thing. Diana had wanted to adopt a pair of twins. Diana hadn't had time to finish. And 5 years later, a pair of twins had run into his meeting room and called him Daddy. He didn't say it was Diana sending them to him. He didn't believe in things like that. But maybe, just maybe, life had finished for Diana what she never had the chance to do. Nico set the glass down on the table, stood, walked down the hallway to the half-closed bedroom door. He pushed it open gently. The 2 girls were fast asleep. Haley lay on her side, her hand still wrapped around Zoe's. Zoe lay on her back, her mouth slightly open, her hair spilled across the pillow. Nico stood in the doorway looking at them for a long time. Then he did something he hadn't done for anyone in 5 years. He stepped inside, pulled the blanket back up over Zoe, picked up the crayon that had fallen beneath Haley's pillow, and set it on the bedside table. Then he stood there for another minute, in the dark, looking at the 2 sleeping children. And he whispered, so softly that no one in the world could hear it, only him and the wall. I'm sorry I came so late. The next morning, for the first time in 5 years, Nico Ferraro woke before dawn for something that had nothing to do with work. He stood in the penthouse kitchen, making coffee, and waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for, until he heard the small slap of little feet against the stone floor, and Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair tangled, her eyes half closed, her arms wrapped around the pillow she was dragging across the floor. Uncle Nico, I'm thirsty. Nico poured a glass of water, knelt down, and handed it to her. Zoe drank it, gave the glass back, then suddenly threw her arms around his neck in one quick hug before shuffling back toward the bedroom. He stayed kneeling there for several seconds after she was gone. his hand still holding the little glass, and he knew he had made his decision. At 8 in the morning, Valerie stepped out of the girl's bedroom. She had been awake for a long time, but she had lingered to tuck the blankets around her daughters and straighten the room, the habit of someone who always wanted to leave a place cleaner than she found it, because she was never sure how long she would be allowed to stay. When she walked into the living room, Nico was sitting at the dining table. No papers, no laptop, no phone, only a cup of coffee and an empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Valerie." It was the first time he had called her by her name. Not Miss Dunn, not you, Valerie. She noticed it at once, and somehow that unsettled her more than any order she had ever heard inside this building. She sat down, back straight, hands resting on her lap. The posture she always kept when sitting in front of someone more powerful than she was. The posture of someone ready to stand up at any moment. "I called my lawyer this morning. At 6 o'clock, Nico said, his voice calm. "I want Haley and Zoe to take the Ferraro name." Silence. Valerie blinked, then blinked again, as if she had heard him wrong and was waiting for him to say it a second time. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Nico cut in, gently but firmly. "I want to." Valerie opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't know what to say. Her whole life, no one had ever given her anything without attaching a condition to it. Foster care gave her a roof, but it came with loneliness. Tyler gave her love, but it came with fists. Every job gave her a paycheck, but it came with exhaustion so deep it hollowed her out. No one gave without taking. Never. "Why?" she asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Nico looked at her, and this time, for the first time since they had met, he didn't look at her the way a boss looked at an employee. He didn't look at her the way a powerful man looked at someone weaker. He didn't look at her the way a man looked at a woman who needed saving. He looked at her the way one human being looked at another. Equal. Real. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "and I don't pity you." Silence. "I've watched you work 2 jobs a day. Sleep 3 hours. Buy nothing for yourself. Bring your daughters down into the basement of this building because there was no one else to watch them. And not once did you complain. Not once." He paused. "That's not a person who needs pity. That's the strongest person I've ever met. And I've met a lot of people who called themselves strong." Valerie felt the tears rise, but she forced them back down. She had cried enough in her life. She didn't want to cry in front of this man. Not because of pride, but because she wanted him to see that she was strong. "I'm trying to do what I should have done 5 years ago," Nico said, his voice softening, almost gentling into a tone that Frank, if he had been standing outside the door, would have recognized at once as the voice Nico had only ever used with Diana. "Live again." Those 2 words hung between them. Simple, but from the mouth of a man who had buried himself alive for 5 years, they weighed more than any declaration he had ever made in front of the family council, his rivals, or the FBI. Valerie looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see Nico Ferraro. She didn't see the boss. She didn't see the silence. She didn't see the man Chicago feared. She saw a man who had been so lonely he had forgotten how to live. A man who had lost his wife, and then locked himself inside a 57-story tower, pretending power was enough. A man her 2 5-year-old daughters had seen straight through from the very first second, when everyone else had only seen the suit and the danger. "The girls chose you," Valerie said, her voice rough but steady. "From the first moment they ran into that meeting room. They didn't know who you were. They didn't know how much money you had. They didn't know how dangerous you were. They just saw a person, and they ran to him." She paused. "Children don't run toward bad people. They run toward the ones their hearts recognize." Nico looked at her, and he smiled. Not a faint smile, not the corner of his mouth lifting halfway and then disappearing. He smiled for real, the first smile that reached his eyes. The smile Frank had waited 5 years to see. The smile Diana would have recognized in an instant if she were still here. Out in the hallway, Frank Basel stood with his back against the wall. The old man heard that laughter through the half-closed door. The sound of it, something he hadn't heard in 5 years. The sound he had thought died with Diana. Frank turned his face away, walked quickly toward the kitchen, not because he had anything to do there, but because that 62-year-old man, after 30 years of serving the Ferraro family, the man who had held himself steady through funerals, through gang wars, through nights of blood and gunpowder, That old man didn't want anyone to see him cry. A few weeks passed, and the penthouse on the 57th floor no longer looked like a place anyone who had ever known it would recognize. Crayon drawings were everywhere. On the refrigerator door was a picture Zoe had drawn of the stray cat the girls used to feed on the south side. The cat in the drawing as big as a house and with wings because, according to Zoe, every cat deserved to fly. On the great glass wall overlooking the city was a picture Haley had drawn of the Chicago skyline in 17 different crayon colors. And somehow she had made it more beautiful than any photograph ever taken of this city, because in her picture, every building had lit windows, and in every window someone was waving. On the walnut desk worth as much as a car, the desk where Nico had once signed million-dollar deals, there was now a red and yellow crayon drawing of Nico wearing a superhero cape. Underneath it, in crooked letters, were the words, "Daddy Nico the strongest." Daddy Nico. Those two words came as naturally as breathing. No one taught them. No one forced them. No one sat the girls down and told them that from now on they should call him Daddy. It happened on an ordinary morning, when Zoe was eating cereal and asked without even looking up, "Daddy, Nico, can we go to the park today?" Nico was pouring coffee. His hand stopped in midair, only for half a second. Then he kept pouring and answered normally, "Yes." As if he had heard those two words all his life, Frank was in the kitchen at that moment. The old man turned his face away and pretended to wipe down a counter that was already clean. Haley began more slowly. She wasn't the kind of child who let it slip out naturally like Zoe. She tried it first in her drawings, writing the word Daddy beneath Nico's picture over and over before she actually said it aloud. And when she said it for the first time, Nico was reading to the girls before bed. Haley was lying beside him, her eyes already heavy with sleep, and she whispered, "Good night, Daddy." Nico stopped reading. He sat there for another 10 minutes after both girls were fast asleep, the book still open in his lap, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, and if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen that his eyes were wet. But no one saw, because that moment belonged only to him. One afternoon, Zoe was sitting on the floor drawing when she suddenly looked up at Nico with the most curious eyes a 5-year-old could possibly have. "Daddy Nico, why is everybody scared of you?" Nico was reading a report. He lowered the paper. "Because I do hard things." Zoe tilted her head. "Hard how?" "The kind not everybody dares to do." Zoe thought about that for a long time. Then she nodded seriously. "Like going to school?" Nico looked at her. Then he laughed. The sound came out naturally, without restraint, without control. Laughter these penthouse walls had long since forgotten. Frank laughed too from the kitchen, and Valerie, who was washing dishes, turned around and looked at the scene. Nico sitting on the floor laughing with the girls, crayon drawings everywhere, the Chicago afternoon sunlight pouring through the glass. And she smiled, the first smile in a very long time that she didn't have to force. That night, late, the penthouse was quiet. Haley and Zoe were asleep on the big sofa in the living room, curled into each other as always. Blankets pulled up to their chins, crayons still smudged on their fingers because they had drawn until they fell asleep. Valerie sat beside them, pulling the blanket back over Zoe because the little girl always kicked it off. She fixed the blanket gently, smoothed Haley's hair, then stood. Nico was standing in front of the great glass wall, his back to the room. Chicago stretched beneath him, millions of lights, millions of lives, millions of stories, the same view he had stared at for 5 years. But tonight it was different. Everything was different. Valerie walked closer, stopped a few steps away from him. She didn't speak. He didn't speak. But he saw her reflection in the glass, and she saw his eyes in that reflection. Their eyes met on the glass. Neither turned around, only through the reflection. And in that moment, between the lights of Chicago and the darkness of the penthouse, something began. Not a blazing love, not a confession, not a kiss, only the quiet realization that the two loneliest people in this tower had finally seen each other. Truly seen each other. Not boss and employee, not strong and weak, but two human beings who had walked in darkness too long and were now standing beside each other in a room filled with the steady breathing of two sleeping children. There was no need to say anything yet. It wasn't time to say anything yet, but they both knew. Nico turned his gaze back to the city. His voice was low, slow, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "People say I have everything. An empire, money, power, a 57-story tower." He paused. They're wrong. He looked toward the sofa, where the girls were sleeping. I've only just begun to have anything. Valerie didn't say a word. She only stepped one pace closer, stood beside him, her shoulder only a few centimeters from his, and the two of them looked out over the city together, in silence. But this time, it was the kind of silence that felt warm. The great wall in the hallway, the wall where Diana's wedding portrait had once hung, the wall that had stayed empty for 5 years, was now covered. Not with an expensive painting, but with dozens of crayon drawings. A winged cat, a 17-color Chicago skyline, superhero Nico, Mr. Frank in a chef's outfit, Mama Valerie with angel wings, and in the center, in the place of honor, was the very first drawing carefully taped back together, the faint line of the tear a testament to the day a dream died and a reality was born. The tall man in black standing beside 2 small children, the drawing she had carried all her life because she believed that one day Daddy would come. And he had. Not through blood, not through DNA, not through a birth certificate, but through a nod in a dark meeting room, through 2 little beds bought at 2 o'clock in the morning, through a box of 64 crayons, through the patience to sit on the floor with 2 children the whole world believed didn't belong to him, because sometimes family doesn't find each other through blood. It finds each other through darkness. 2 lonely people walk in darkness long enough. Then one day, they stumble into each other and decide not to walk alone anymore. This story gives us a deep lesson that real family isn't decided by blood, but by the heart's choice. That sometimes the strongest people are also the loneliest ones, and sometimes all it takes is one brave child running up and wrapping her arms around your legs to remind you that life still holds so many things worth living for. In real life, each of us has moments when we feel like Nico, sitting alone at the highest point and yet feeling the emptiest. And each of us can also be Valerie, exhausted but never giving up because someone needs us. If this story touched your heart, how did it make you feel? What did you think listening to it? Please share it with us in the comments below. We always want to hear what lives deep in your hearts, because every story is only truly complete when someone feels it too. If you enjoy stories that reach into emotion like this, please hit the like button, share this video with the people you love, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the beautiful stories we bring every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with love and peace. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.